Okay, here we are again to cover chapter 10, the gender sexuality chapter. I hope all of you are still healthy and doing well and employed. I know my daughter, who works at RC Willey, she was told just today that they're going to be closed indefinitely. So she's not laid off, she's not fired, she still has a job, but she's not going to be able to work for at least a little while until things turn around, and I don't know how long that's going to be. She'll survive, but I worry about other people who may not have as much money in the bank or much support system to help them. I hope that all of you are getting through this okay. I know it's going to be a struggle for some of you. I'm also just on another note, I'm still working out of my office making these videos and hoping that maybe I can get these done before things get so out of hand that I can't even get here because I won't be allowed to even come to school. So anyway, we're going to get through this. I'm still optimistic. It's kind of a frustrating, crazy time though, isn't it? We can just plug ahead. That's all we can do. All right, chapter 10. I changed my slides around so that they'd be a little more visible on the screen. It's not perfect. It doesn't look great. We'll just have to deal with it. So first thing I want to cover in this chapter is the difference between sex and gender. So sex is the biological aspects of our maleness or our femaleness or whatever it is that we are in terms of gender these days. So sex would be, in the traditional sense, your XY chromosomes or your XX chromosomes that make you the traditional male or female. It's your anatomy, it's your physiology, your hormones. It's a biological / physiological concept. Gender, on the other hand, would be thought of as a psychological concept, but more than that, it includes your gender identity, your psychological identity with being, in terms of being male or female internally. It would also be the social role that you play, that the society also expects out of you. So there's a lot of socialization as well as cognitive processing and psychological issues associated with gender. Most of the time, your sex and your gender are going to match up. It doesn't seem to all the time, so that can be an issue we're going to talk about in a bit. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the issues that can come into play with sex and gender. First of all, I want to talk about paraphilias. Paraphilias are what we call sexual arousal disorders. They don't typically have anything to do with one's gender orientation or gender preference or their gender identity. They're more having to do with the primary means or the major means through which you gain sexual arousal. They come in many varieties. I'm going to start off with one that, and actually before I get into that, I want to mention that paraphilias are paraphilias when they get in the way of your ability to be happy, to enjoy life, and to manage successfully in your everyday activities, school, work, relationships. And that's true, as we'll talk about in chapter 14. It's true of mental illnesses in general. Paraphilias can become mental illnesses, and that's why they're listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. All of those things in the manual are listed because they can get in the way of somebody's ability to deal successfully and happily and so-called normally with everyday life. So we'll start off with a paraphilia that seems at first just kind of maybe fun, no big deal, and that would be transvestism. So transvestism traditionally has been a male. A transvestite traditionally has been a male that is typically heterosexual who desires to cross-dress, not for any gender issues, not for because of societal trends or fads or anything like that, but for sexual arousal. So a transvestite's, in the extreme, primary source of sexual gratification and arousal in general would come from cross-dressing as a female. And maybe not just cross-dressing, but having sexual activity in association with some aspect or element of women's clothing. So again, this seemed pretty innocuous, not that big a deal if somebody wants to gain their sexual arousal. And it seems to be, even if it seems to be their only way to gain major sexual arousal, then so be it, that's fine, not hurting anybody, not that big a deal. Why do we even list it as a paraphilia? The reason why it's listed as a paraphilia is because when it gets extreme, say a man is married to a woman and she kind of thinks it's cute, it's fun, it adds to their excitement. In a sense, as we talked about in the last chapter, chapter 8, it's like turning up the volume on the TV set. It creates more arousal, which creates a more intensely pleasurable experience. You know, if that's the way it is perceived at first in this relationship, then fine, it's no big deal. Just go with it. But what happens often in a paraphilia, transvestic paraphilia, is that at some point the woman realizes that it's not really about their fun, their increased or enhanced sexual pleasure. It's about his hang-up, and it's getting in the way of their relationship. And so it can begin to be listed or diagnosed as a mental illness, because then it's getting in the way of something important to the two people involved. Still, it seems like not a big deal. And so I start with this, and then I go next to something that does seem like a big deal, just to give you an idea how the gamut runs in paraphilias from something that's kind of trivial and not that big a deal to something that's pretty darn serious. So that would be pedophilia. So a pedophile is somebody whose primary and maybe only means of gaining sexual arousal is through having sex with a minor, or imagining having sex with a minor. So this is illegal, right? This can run you in jail, and we tend to think, throw the pedophile in jail and throw away the key. It's disgusting to most people. And yet it's really in the same category as transvestism, which doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Many paraphilias, most of them seem to be something that's probably a product of learning and one's socialization. Pedophilia, on the other hand, has been discussed by some people as being at least partially due to some sort of biological dysfunction. And maybe that dysfunction is present at birth in some way that we don't really understand, and then gets manifest later, or maybe it's a product of early learning or something that we don't really understand. But it does seem to be maybe biological. The reason why we think it might be biological is because the recidivism rate, or the repeat offense rate for pedophiles, seems to be very high. They tend to often just keep repeatedly offending, and they go to therapy. Clinicians try to rehabilitate them, but it just doesn't seem to work. Incidentally, that seems to also be the case with younger antisocial personality individuals as well. ASPD, as we talked about in Chapter 8, these are people who tend to violate the rights of other people and get sort of a rush out of that, and have no conscience maybe in violating the rights of other people. They tend to use other people for their own benefit. As we mentioned in Chapter 8, these people may be wired up differently from the rest of us as well. There may be something biological there. Their recidivism rate also is very high. Again, further suggesting some sort of biology going on there. Anyway, pedophilia, transvestism in the same category. They can get you in trouble in some way or another, and when they do get in the way of your everyday life and your sense of happiness, then these become disorders. You also have voyeurism. Voyeurs typically don't want to have sex with you. That would not be as exciting for them. It's more exciting to spy on others when they're having sex, to watch them getting undressed, or maybe even just purely spying on them, because these voyeurs have a sense of control and manipulation of other people without these other people's awareness, and that may be sexually arousing, that sense of control. I want to mention that many paraphiliacs have decreased, lowered self-esteem, lower social skills. They have a sex drive. They have a hard time acting on that sex drive in the traditionally accepted ways. And so it comes out in the form of maybe a paraphilia. There's probably more to it than that. That's probably simplistic, but it does seem that many people with paraphilias have found an alternative way to manage their sex drive, and to fulfill their sexual gratification, be sexually gratified, that runs counter to social norms. Frauderists, these are people who rub up against other people in tight places, in a subway, in a dance situation, at a club, in a place where they could maybe get away with it, which enhances their sexual arousal because they're taking advantage of somebody else without these other people's consent. It's risky, and that enhances the sexual arousal as well. It's turning up the volume a little bit. They don't want to have sex with you typically. They just want to rub up against you and have sexual gratification through that means. Probably some of you women, I hate to say this, but some of you women have been victimized by a frauderist to a certain degree. And whether that person was a full-blown frauderist and typically did that sort of thing, or maybe it was just kind of a one-time, two-time behavior that isn't part of a routine behavior. But either way, it may have been done as a way for them to gain sexual pleasure, and you were the victim. Again, frauderists probably don't want to have sex with you. It's not as exciting. It's not as risky. It doesn't create as much sexual gratification. Exhibitionists are flashers. They want to exhibit themselves to other people. They gain sexual pleasure from that. Again, probably don't want to have sex. It's not as exciting. Have a sex drive, have low self-esteem, have difficulty interacting with other people, don't have great social skills there. In a sense, all of these people, may have a hard time getting to know somebody and put themselves out there on the limb, make them vulnerable, which inevitably happens when you make advances on somebody, and the possibility is that they could turn you down and they could put you in your place, humble you quite an extent. And so they have found other ways of gaining their sexual gratification, which makes them less vulnerable and less subject to being cut off, being ridiculed. Although it does seem like you may be ridiculed for some of these paraphilias once they become fully known. Fetishism is a type of paraphilia that involves objects, or in general something other than normal, consenting, adult-to-adult sexual behavior, sexual activity. In terms of objects, common objects that people that have become fetishes for them are clothing, women's underwear, again in the man's case, but also rubber items, feet, socks, shoes, nylon material, pantyhose. There was a case several years ago. He was called the toe bandit. He would sneak into women's apartments at night and rape their toes. He would pull up the bed covers, wasn't concerned with their interested in their bodies other than their toes, would suck on their toes. Then there was the guy similarly who had a fetish with women's shoes, and he had closets full of women's shoes that he would steal from women or from stores, and then he would get his sexual pleasure through fantasizing with the shoes, and maybe women in the shoes, and that's all he was interested in. Sometimes there are fetishes associated with people who are amputees, who want to have sex. The most amazing experience sexually they could have would be to have sex with a woman, with a person who's amputated. But fetishes can also relate to other body parts, hair color, eyeglasses. Some pretty crazy things, I guess. Again, most of these things seem to be learned, but maybe there's some sort of biological component within us that maybe predisposes us a little bit to these kind of paraphilias. Now, paraphilias are sexual arousal disorders, but gender dysphoria is a gender identity disorder. So we've heard a lot about people who are transgenders these days. To be transgender is to feel uncomfortable with one's assigned sex at birth, the one that you're assigned at birth. In the extreme, a transgender individual may feel like nature trapped them in the wrong body, and they may feel like they want to change their sex to match their identity. So for them, their identity is correct. How they feel psychologically in terms of what gender they are, that's correct. Even if it's a mismatch with their body, what's incorrect is their body. And so they may want to change their sex to match their gender. So let me tell you a little bit of a story. Not long after my stroke, our ATV accident and stroke, I started going back to church after not being there for 4 months or so. And I noticed when I was sitting in church on the back row, there was this woman, older woman, that seemed a little masculine to me, but not unusual. I've seen a lot of feminine-looking men and acting men and masculine-looking and acting women all the time, so that's not a big deal. But I think maybe that's one of the reasons why this woman stood out to me. And maybe, just maybe, I felt like she seemed a little familiar to me. It's been so long now. It's been 4 years. It's been 3.5 years. I can't remember for certain, but it's possible that she seemed a little familiar to me, and that's the reason why I was curious about her and kept trying to find out more about her. I asked around. People in the congregation didn't know much about her. Nobody was really reaching out to her and getting to know her, which I thought was kind of unusual. But after the fact, maybe it's because she did come across a little bit too masculine, and people wondered what was going on there, and maybe were scared by her a little bit. Scared, uncomfortable. Maybe uncomfortable is the right word. One day, this woman sat down right next to me, and she started talking to me, and she was really talkative and just kept going on about something for about 5 minutes before I had a chance to say too much. But within that 5 minutes, all of a sudden I realized that I know this person, but not as Vanessa, which is the name that she told me she went by, but as Bob. And I hadn't seen Bob in probably 5 to 7 years, maybe more than that. But before that, I had known Bob for probably 20 to 30 years as a man. I knew that he was married, had a child, a daughter. Knew that he was kind of quirky, a little bit unusual, a little bit hard to get along with at times. I kind of struggled socially, not really emotionally and psychologically, but kind of struggled in life to a certain extent. I knew that all of that about Bob, but a lot of people are like that. I didn't really think too much about Bob beyond his little quirks. Anyway, I immediately knew after this Vanessa was talking to me that this was Bob. And I said, hey, after it took me a couple of weeks, but after a couple of weeks of her sitting down next to me and talking to me, and I think the reason why she sat down next to me is because she was new in that congregation and she didn't really know anybody, but she knew me, and it was her attempt to kind of come out, I guess, and to kind of break the ice and be able to feel comfortable in this new congregation with her as a female now. So I said, after a couple of weeks, I said, hey, I think I know who you are, and so I'm wondering if you want to come by the house, talk to Anita and I, and, you know, kind of catch up on past news and see how things are going with you. And she said, fine. And so she came over a week or so later, and she said, we asked her, now, is this something that you've been feeling for a long, long time? Or is it a recent thing? And she said, well, actually, I never realized that I was a female until about 2 or 3 years ago. And you have to realize she was probably 62 or 3, maybe 65 at the time. And so until she was into her 60s, she never had any gender identity issues. Always felt herself as a male. And of course, as I said, she was heterosexual. As a male, he was heterosexual, married, had a child. But somewhere in his 60s, he just gradually began to realize that he was really a female. And it took a couple of months, but after a little bit of time with some support through the transgender group locally, she made the plunge and started dressing completely as a female. And I've since found out she probably has undergone the surgery change, the sex change, and she is surgically now, biologically, except for the hormone, except for the chromosomes, she's a female. And I must say, having gotten to know her a lot more as Vanessa over the last 3.5 years, and having her over to our house for dinner several times, and talking with her a lot, I would say she's a much nicer and more pleasant female than she ever was as a male. So I guess I present that to you as an example of how somebody who has never had any issues with gender identity, might be taken aback by this sort of thing in somebody else that you know. I'm guessing that many of you have had a similar experience. Maybe it's similar to the experience that I've had with Vanessa. He doesn't seem to be crazy. He doesn't seem to be mentally ill. And actually, frankly, myself and my family, those of us in our family who knew him as Bob, feel like this is great for her. And who are we to question the possibility that maybe she's right, that maybe she really is trapped in the wrong body, and that she should have the ability and the freedom and the social freedom, free of ostracism and that sort of thing, to be able to do what she wants in terms of her sex related to her gender. Now, I want to just pursue this a little further. Actually, before I do that, I want to mention one other thing. Of course, you have to realize this is a conservative Christian congregation that really is not really going to be all that socially accepting of a transgender individual. In spite of that, in spite of the fact that there's very few in this congregation who are willing to befriend her and talk to her and get to know her and associate with her, she continues to come to church, and she seems to have the same beliefs and the same conservative Christian beliefs system that she had before. That hasn't changed. And I give her a lot of credit for that. I don't know that I could be as accepting and as tolerant of other people who are so unaccepting of her. But let me go into this area here. in the form of a question. Is it possible that a transgender individual is correct, that nature made a mistake and assigned them the wrong body? Now think about that for a second. Nature does not mean God, I don't think, necessarily. And let me back up even further. If you're a religious person, at some point, you always have to come up to grips with what C.S. Lewis called the problem of pain. How do you reconcile your belief in a God with the fact that every day things that are unfortunate, that are hard to deal with, happen to people who are minding their own business? How do you reconcile the negative things that happen to people when there's supposedly a God that wants the best for us and loves us? Anyway, I don't want to get too far into the religious element of this, but I know that some of you are religious, maybe a lot of you are, and even if you aren't now, you have that upbringing maybe to a certain extent. And so maybe that figures into your difficulty dealing with and understanding the gender identity issues and the gender dysphoria issues that some people might have. Is it possible that nature might make a mistake? And again, to go further into the idea that I'm not talking about God, I'm talking about nature. Every day, people are born with differences that make them different from other people and that make it harder for them to adjust in life and to deal with basic life. People are born blind and deaf and with deformed limbs, with brain abnormalities that lead to learning disabilities or difficulty dealing with basic cognitive processes. And in some ways, I'm a little bit uncomfortable equating gender identity issues with other things that are handicapping. But if you can set that aside and maybe some of the not politically correct elements of that aside, I just want to point out that every day people are born in ways that are fundamentally different from the rest of us, and it creates problems for them. How do you reconcile that as a religious person? I guess I've come to the belief that, while still holding on to my basic religious views, that this may be another one of those things that just happens, and maybe it all fits into God's plan some way, in a way that I don't understand, but maybe it does. And I guess maybe another more basic issue is you're going to have people like I have who are going to go through these issues in your lifetime. As a society, and as individuals, we need to learn how to deal with it. And you have to understand that if you believe that nature placed you in the wrong body, that there was this error made biologically, then that's got to be one of the worst handicaps you could ever have. Because what's more basic to us, really, than our maleness or our femaleness? To be able to have to go through life, or as long as you go through life, or at least this part of your life, thinking that nature gave you the wrong body, that's got to be one of the most devastating things to your self-esteem, to your understanding of yourself and your identity that there could be. At least I'm beginning to realize that, and I'm trying to get you to think about that as well. Now let me point out a couple other things related to gender dysphoria. It's typically 3 times more common in men wanting to transition to become women, than in women. And it's also not really easily changed. This gender dysphoria feeling, being dysphoric or dissatisfied or uncomfortable with your assigned sex, this gender dysphoria is not easily changed through therapy. And in fact, most people who are gender dysphoric are deemed to not be mentally ill in terms of other basic mental illness issues listed in the DSM-3. Their other functioning in life doesn't seem to be problematic, other than that they're gender dysphoric, and that could lead to depression and anxiety and all sorts of social adjustment issues. But other than that, which you can blame entirely on could blame entirely on their gender dysphoria. They're not mentally ill. They're not different from the rest of us. And I want to go back and talk about homosexuality in 1973. The reason why it was taken by the APA out of the DSM manual, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, was because it was found through a lot of research that homosexuals, people whose sexual orientation was same sex, were not mentally ill. They were not different from the rest of us in any major way, any significant identifiable way. And it turns out they found with homosexuality that therapy didn't seem to work. In fact, the best kind of therapy for homosexuals historically has been going with the flow and giving into the same-sex attraction and living that life. And related to that is all the attempts in the last several years to stop sexual orientation conversion therapy. That seems to actually create more damage than good in people who are homosexual, and so there's been an attempt to kind of outlaw those attempts to convert people to change their sexual orientation. It all kind of goes back to the idea that perhaps there's something biological there and nothing psychological that can be readily changed, and so we just need to accept it. And so what I want to point out is that gender dysphoria is similar. Therapy doesn't seem to work, and these people with gender dysphoric issues don't seem to be mentally ill. The single most effective intervention technique for extremely gender dysphoric individuals is sex reassignment surgery. Now, I should point out that not all gender dysphoric individuals want to go to sex reassignment, and maybe that's because the sex reassignment thing it's a huge change and a drastic change, and maybe they're nervous about going to that effect. And there's also, even if the sex reassignment surgery might be best for them, they still feel like socially and psychologically it's going to be hard for family members and others to accept, and so maybe they're reluctant to take that step, even if they feel like it might be best for them. But anyway, with all that in mind, the most successful intervention for gender dysphoric individuals who firmly feel that they want to be the opposite sex is sex reassignment surgery. And I'm not saying it works 100% of the time, maybe not even 90% of the time, but it works as much as some of the major biological interventions that we have for depression and anxiety. Say 70% of the time those medications work to alleviate the extreme versions of these people's depression and anxiety. Sex reassignment surgery is similar. If I just read recently in a BBC article that the amount of transfer, gender reassignment surgery, when people transfer their sex to the one that that matches their gender identity, the amount of kind of dysphoria or dissatisfaction associated with their change of sex is very low. But it does occur occasionally. And this particular article, interestingly enough, talked about two couples, one males who transitioned to become females when they were younger. They were attracted to each other and eventually developed this relationship. But later on, both of them wanted to detransition back into becoming male. And the same thing happened in this article with another couple who were females transitioned into males, and then later on they both decided that they want to become females again. That does happen, but those are rare. I just want to lay this all out there on the table so you can get a feel for some of the things that are going on with gender dysphoria. I also want to point out something else that's kind of interesting, and I'm not sure if it's related. I'm not sure if it has anything to do with gender dysphoria, but I'll put it out there and you can look it up and decide for yourselves. Now, there's very little known about this, what I'm going to talk about, but what I'm going to talk about is body integrity identity disorder, called BIID, body integrity identity disorder. Sometimes it's just shortened as body integrity disorder, BID. And for the most part, these people are dissatisfied and uncomfortable with the fact that they're not disabled, that they're well-bodied. They want traditionally, and again, this is rare, and the people that have been diagnosed with this are few in number, but among those numbers, most of them want to have their arm or their leg amputated in order to feel normal. Now, what I haven't mentioned is people with extreme gender dysphoria look at their genitals and they feel repulsed by their genitals. They're just disgusted by them, and they want them gone. And they have to be gone in order for them to feel normal. Or they want them changed in order for them to feel normal. People with BID feel the same thing about their right or their left arm or their right or left leg. They're not going to feel normal, they believe, until it's gone. They go to the doctor, of course, and the medical facility and say, please cut off my arm or leg. And of course, the professional is saying, no way, that would be handicapping you, we're not going to do that. And you might argue, well, if somebody's being changed from one section to another one, that's pretty similar. Why do we allow that? Well, you're not handicapping somebody if you change them from a male to a female, but if you take off their right arm, you're handicapping them. So on that basis, it's not done. What then happens is that these people will go home frustrated and depressed and anxious because they got this right arm they're not supposed to have, and so they mangle it, they start to cut it off, and then they go to the ER and they say, you wouldn't cut this off before, but now you have to in order to save my life. So please do it now. And it gets done. And the research says that in those few cases where it's happened, these people have had their arm or leg amputated, their adjustment is better than it was before. Cured maybe is a strong word, but they got their wish and the psychological trauma is gone. And the little research there is on these people, it's hard to convince them that they're just crazy. They just need good therapy. Therapy doesn't seem to work. Again, what seems to be most effective for them is giving them their wish. Now, we have a small sample size, so it's hard to say for certain, but at least among the small sample size, what seems to be most successful is giving them their wish. And when you look at their mental health status, they're not crazy, typically. Now, I did read an article recently that suggested that there may be some relationship between personality disorders and perhaps even some gender dysphoria and body integrity identity disorder. But for the most part, again, they don't seem to be stereotypically crazy or just extremely mentally ill. So again, you have the situation where, how do we explain this? And I guess the answer is we really don't know. But maybe this sort of thing can happen, where people's brains or whatever causes them to feel this about them that makes them different from other people, and causes them to not feel social norms in terms of being okay with your gender, okay with the fact that you have two arms or two legs. To me, it just sort of complicates the issue. All this is complicated. I don't really claim to understand it as a cisgender male. I've never had any of these issues, and I know that makes it hard for me to understand this. But at the same time, I want to go back to my friend Vanessa. We have a nice relationship with her, and as I said, she's well-adjusted, and I think a very good person and mentally healthy, and I can begin to understand that maybe, just maybe, she's right, and I'm not going to hold it against her. Anyway, let's go from sexual arousal disorders to and from gender identity disorders issues to you can't see this on the screen, to gender differences between traditional males and females. So on the screen in the PowerPoint presentation, if you look at it yourself, I want to point out that one of the gender differences has to do with spatial intelligence, spatial skills, in particular spatial rotation skills. It turns out that males tend to have a better ability to look at a three-dimensional object from one perspective and turn it around in their mind and imagine what it would look like from the other side. Females typically don't do as well on those rotational skills as females. So what I have on the screen are two block assemblies that if you rotate this one to match that one, it is a match. If you rotate this one to match that one, it's a match. But down here, they're not a match. And you can look at them for yourself to see if you can see that the first one's a match, the second one's a match, and the third one isn't. If you're able to do that, then you have good spatial rotation skills. Again, males tend to have better skills than females. And then we enter into the territory of the joke related to men being hopelessly lost someplace, trying to navigate without asking directions, going around in circles and wasting all this time. And the female in the car, or being told the story later on, is going, why didn't you just ask directions? Well, maybe the reason why the male didn't ask directions is because the male has better spatial skills, spatial rotation skills, and knows from experience that by working at it and trying to figure out, they could probably figure it out. Whereas the female probably knows, look, I've tried in the past to figure these things out on my own, but my spatial skills aren't the greatest, so I just need to ask. So I kind of don't get the jokes that surround and all the ridicule that surrounds males not asking directions versus females asking directions. It kind of makes sense to me. And there's good scientific evidence that says that this is a reliable gender difference. Now, I want to point out that there's spatial rotation skills, and there's also just spatial awareness skills. So there's different types of spatial skills. And here's one that females tend to excel in compared to males. This has to do with being aware of what's in your environment and being able to remember what was in your environment at a particular time and place. So in this aspect of spatial intelligence, they'll put a person in a room, male or female, and this person thinks they're waiting for another experiment to begin that they're going to be a subject in. But in the room, while they're waiting for 10, 15 minutes, there's several items that are intentionally placed there, because later on, after 10, 15 minutes, the researcher comes and says, okay, now we're done, but before you leave, what I want you to do, we're not going to have you do another experiment, but what I want you to do before you go is list, we're going to take the person out of the room, take the person out of the room, well, I want you to list everything and describe as well as you can everything that you can remember in that room. And it turns out that females are better at doing that than males. So females are more aware of their environment, can remember and accurately describe more of their environment than males can. And that's probably an important spatial skill as well. All right. Another gender difference, this one you can see, is verbal intelligence, verbal skills. So it turns out that word games like this, thinking up as many words that begin with M as you can within a short amount of time, games that involve reading words backwards and being able to tell what they are frontwards, boggle type games, those kind of games females tend to traditionally do better at than males. Females learn language earlier than males. They have a richer vocabulary than males do early on, and probably for throughout life. I don't really know the data on that, but I'm guessing that that's throughout life. Females have a better facility with language than males do. Fewer learning disabilities, reading disabilities in females than males. So again, that's a reliable gender difference. Probably the two most reliable gender differences there are. So let me go back. There's a question of, are men and women so different that it's as if we're from different planets? Men are from Mars and women from Venus, for instance, metaphorically. It turns out that we're not that different, but there are two pretty reliable gender differences, and those are them. Now, there are some other gender differences. One is the processing of emotions. You can't see the comic, and you can't even see all the wording here, but the comic talks about how women maybe or addresses the issue, or the fact that women may be more proficient in dealing with emotions. Thank you for sharing your feelings, the therapist says to this man and woman, obviously in premarital counseling, it says on the door. Thank you for sharing your feelings so honestly, Dean, but the first thing you must realize is that as a man, your perceptions are hopelessly inaccurate. So, meant to be a joke, but there is research that says that women are better at reading the emotions of other people and better at detecting, and better at accurately expressing emotions in their own faces so that other people can read them. And they have a better ability of communicating emotions to other people. Men tend to have a harder time. Now, some of that is obviously going to be due to socialization. And I want to point out that every gender difference that we could think about, including the first two that I mentioned, spatial rotation skills and spatial awareness skills, and verbal intelligence, verbal skills, they could all be due to nurture. Likewise, this one here could be due to the way that men are socialized relative to women. But maybe there is a biological difference that underlies the emotional skills difference between males and females. Just like there might be a biological difference between males and females in natural ability to rotate objects in space, or in females to be able to understand and process and communicate effectively with language. So let me list out a short list of reliable gender differences between males and females. Females have superior verbal skills on average, and they are shown to be more nurturing. And this may be kind of feeding into the stereotype, and maybe a sexist stereotype, that females are more cut out to be mothers and to be a parent. And maybe some women don't like this idea. Maybe some men don't like this. But there is some research that shows that if you take a strange infant to the man or woman in the study, if you take a strange infant that the man or woman doesn't know, and you place that infant in the arms of that person and allow them to just have that baby infant for several minutes, what you find generally is that women are more likely to just more comfortably and readily talk to the infant, cuddle it, love it, imitate it, engage in motherese communication, whereas the man is more often going to, after a few minutes, feel uncomfortable and try to give the infant back. I know that would be me. So I can be nurturing to my own children, my own grandchildren, but historically I know I've had a hard time being that way with other people's kids. Females tend to be nurturing with all kids, of course their own, but even to a great degree, kids whom they have no relationship to. That's what the research says. Females tend to have better facility with emotional skills. Males tend to have better spatial skills, and they tend to be more violently aggressive than females. So it's been stated enough times that I believe it's got to be true, that there's been no society ever studied, no culture ever studied, in which women were more violently aggressive than men. Men are always the more violently aggressive. Now, some feminists have said, that sort of suggests that women can't be assertive and aggressive, that we're biologically maybe incapable of being that way. So, and that's not a good feeling. So let's study that. There are some people who have studied how women can be aggressive, and what they've determined is that women can be aggressive, but it's usually more often with their verbal skills, with language, than with their physical aggression. So we say that females are more relationally aggressive and verbally aggressive. Females are more physically aggressive, or females are more covertly aggressive. Males are more overtly aggressive. All right, so I purposely made that list small just to make the point that there are some, but a small number of reliable gender differences. So the idea is that men and women are different a little bit, but not so much that we could be called as be said to be from different planets. We're actually more similar than we are different. All right, so I want to talk about one element of these differences, though, one additional element of these differences, and that is this. So if you look at, say, the continuum of male-female, continuum of, let's say, something like verbal skills, you would find that the average female is going to be a little bit higher on the continuum of verbal skills relative to the average male. But that difference between the average female and the average male is actually quite small on this long, large, wide continuum. And the other thing that needs to be realized is that this is the average female and the average male, not every female and not every male. The fact is you're going to have some males that are highly verbally skilled and some females that are not highly verbally skilled at all. Since this point on the continuum is just the indication of an average, what we can do is draw the bell curve of representing the distribution of verbal skills for females, and note that there are some females that are highly verbally skilled and some that are not so verbally skilled. But it's a wide distribution, and this is just the midpoint of that distribution. Likewise, the male mark on this line is also the midpoint of a large distribution. And so you have a lot of males that are high in verbal skills and a lot that are low in verbal skills, but most are going to average around this midpoint. So what I see here and what most scientists see is not that men and women are so different, they're from different planets, metaphorically, but that their differences, although they exist statistically, even if not practically, their differences are really small in size, small in number. What I see here is much more overlap than difference between these distributions, and that's what scientists see. And all of that basically is to suggest that most scientists disagree with John Gray's book, Women Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. We're really not. And in fact, another way of looking at it, if you want to get along with somebody of the opposite gender, the best way to get along with them is to think about them as an individual, not a member of a stereotyped group like males or females. Always, whether your partner is a male or a female, think about that person as an individual with his or her unique characteristics and quirks. And you're going to deal with that person better. You're going to get along with that person better than if you think about that person first and foremost as a male or female. Similarly, hopefully you see this, I'm going to get along with my African American friends or my Asian friends better if I think of them as individuals than if I think about them as African Americans or Asians. Same thing is true with gender. That's what scientists say. Now, just for, you can't see this on the screen because I couldn't change the background on this, but just for the fun of it, somebody showed me once this picture. You can look at it online, on the PowerPoint online, because somebody put on the internet several years back an image of what possibly the female brain might look like if we could see the areas of the brain, the female brain, that are related to their characteristics, their stereotype characteristics. So it's meant to be funny. It's not meant to be taken seriously, but I do want to point out that we haven't really been able to find wholesale differences in the male and female brain that would explain the reason why we have the few gender differences that we do. The differences that exist are probably subtly different in the male and female brain, and probably a lot of it is due to nurture rather than nature, and that's one of the reasons why we don't really see it biologically in the brain. So that's the female brain. You can look at that online on the PowerPoint presentation online, and this is the male brain. You can probably see on the screen the large areas devoted to sex. Again, just meant to be fun. Let's talk about some gender theories. So there are some differences, not a whole lot, but some gender differences. The question is where do they come from? One theory says that they're entirely learned, totally a product of nurture. This would be kind of the behaviorist view of gender differences. And if you think about it, we raise males and females differently. Going back to the verbal differences between males and females. We talk to female children more than we talk to male children. We physically manhandle, roughhouse male infants, male babies, and male toddlers more so than we do female toddlers and young children. That right there could explain the reason why, in terms of nurture, females are more verbally skilled and males are more physically aggressive. And we probably also talk, and I know this is true, it's not probably, research says that we talk in more emotion-laden terms to our female children or to young females. So we condition them at a very young age to be more emotionally connected and more emotionally skilled. We do that less to males, and that's one of the reasons maybe why we tend to be emotionally clueless in the extreme. It goes really far, really extreme. It's more than just that kind of stuff. We give females female names, we give males male names, we dress them a certain way, we give them certain toys. All those things condition and push our children to be more stereotypically male or female than the opposite. One time, my daughter was 11 or 12, and she said to me, "Dad, women don't drive as well as males, do they? Women don't drive as well as men, do they?" And I kind of did the Jean Piaget thing, didn't say, "That's not true. Why are you asking that?" And tried to put it down. Rather than that approach, I just said, "That's an interesting question. So what do you think? And where do you think, where did that come from in your mind?" Well, she said, "Well, yeah, it seems to me like men are better drivers than women. And the reason why I think that is because every time we get in the car and go someplace as a family, or even if it's just you and mom, when you get in the car and go some places, you always drive. So is that because you're a better driver?" And I says, "Well, what about your other friends, your friends and their parents and other people that you know?" She says, "Well, so-and-so down the street, her dad always drives too." And she started pointing out all these other families in which the man always drove. And then, mind you, this was back in when was this? Maybe 90s, early 90s. But through her experience, she had come to the conclusion that males and females had different driving skills. And when I thought about that it was just a product of what she had seen and observed in her own family and elsewhere, I thought back to when my wife and I, future wife and I, were dating, just started dating, and I didn't have a car, but she did. I had a car that I was going to take back to school. This was a school in Utah, Brigham Young University. I bought this car. I was going to take it back to school, but I went out on a date the week before school started. It was at the Old Century Theaters on Howe Avenue, Howe and Arden. And when I came out from the movie with my date, my car was gone. And realized it was stolen, had to get a ride home. Went off to school without a car. 2 or 3 weeks later, the police found the car abandoned someplace and totally stripped. Anyway, I didn't have a car that full first year in college. So as we go on our first date, my future wife said, here's the keys to the car. She had a Volkswagen Bug, which is the same thing that I had that was now gone. Here's the keys, you drive. And I said, "Great, yeah, I'll drive." And that's exactly what I wanted because I like to drive. And she didn't mind not driving. She kind of wanted the male in her life to drive. And so she was happy to give up the keys. And ever since then, I'm the driver. And whenever we travel places, if it's a 9-hour trip to San Diego or something like that, I'll drive 6, she'll drive 3 or something like that. If I had realized that was going to teach my kids, my daughters, to be gender stereotypical in their thinking about male and female abilities related to driving in particular, I would have said to my future wife at that point, and it would have been very presumptuous probably, but I would have said, "No, we might have kids later on. I don't want them to learn fallaciously, falsely, that males are better than drivers than females. So you take the keys, you drive, and then we'll raise our kids to be gender neutral when it comes to driving ability." Of course, I didn't do that because I was pretty stereotypical, and the result was that my daughters learn to be gender stereotypical in terms of driving skill, in terms of what they think, who they think is more skilled. And I'm wondering if that happens in your relationships, if you've kind of carried on that same tradition that you learned from your parents. And I just want to point out that's an example of so many gender roles that we just learn simply by observation and simply by imitating what we've observed, and we perpetuate those and carry those on for our children, and it just goes on and on and on. So anyway, that's all part of gender, the social learning theory. It's the product of our nurturing. Then there's the gender schema theory. I won't go into this too much, but it's basically an addition to the social learning theory. Gender schema theorists believe in the social learning theory. They accept it and say that nurture is hugely important, but they ask an additional question. Why is it that kids pick up so readily on all the social learning that we give them? Why are they so quick to learn from the models and the subtle teaching that we give them about gender? So gender schema theorists say it's because of the way that we naturally process information. We naturally develop schemata or schema, which are mental categories to help us understand the world. We put all of our experiences into nice, neat little boxes. And in doing so, we're simplifying the world in terms of those categories. It helps us to understand a complex world in a more simplistic way, in a more general way. And it frees us up to be able to use our brain resources for other things that are more complex, that require more thought processing. And gender schema theorists say that one of the major, probably first schemes that children develop is the male-female scheme. Well, there are two different people on the planet. There are males and there are females. And how can I mean, kids aren't naturally saying this to themselves, but at some point, unconsciously, they're kind of asking the question, how do I differentiate between these two types of people? Well, males tend to do this and females tend to do that. And so that helps me to understand the differences between the two. And I'm one of those. So that means that I need to do this. And she's one of those. And so she needs to do that. And so this cognitive processing technique that we use to make sense of the world, putting people and things into categories, automatically makes us prone to stereotyping and generalizations, which added to what we're taught in the world leads us to be gender stereotypical in the way that we think about males and females. Now, the biological theory basically says, even though we can't really find the true biological bases for a lot of the gender differences we could study, maybe there is something subtle that underlies biologically the reason why females have better emotional skills and they're more nurturing, and males are more physically aggressive and have better spatial skills, spatial rotational skills. Just to illustrate that idea, there's the David Reimer story. David Reimer is probably mentioned, that's R-E-I-M-E-R, mentioned in the book, but I'll elaborate a little bit. He was a twin, an identical twin, and at birth, he and his identical twin were not circumcised, but 8 months or so, 6 to 8 months into their childhood, they were having urination problems, and the doctor suggested that we could get rid of those problems and maybe help these kids in other ways if we circumcised them. So David goes in first, and he gets circumcised. But the doctor made a mistake. He had a cauterizing tool to seal off the blood vessels to handle the bleeding so there was less of it. And he got it too hot, maybe placed it on the penis too long, and burnt it off. So the mother describes how she went into the hospital room afterwards, after she was told the bad news. And from David's groin, she sees what looked like a burnt string. And she's all upset. Everybody's upset. The doctor's apologetic. But over the next few months, they had to figure out, with the help of therapists, what's the best way to deal with this. John Money was called in, an expert on gender at the time. This was in the 1960s, early 60s. He was called in, and his advice was, look, gender is primarily learned. So he was a social learning theorist. Gender is primarily learned. And since he's going to have huge emotional and psychological problems if he is a boy without a penis, a man without a penis, and back then they didn't have the techniques that we have now to create penises, it just really wasn't biologically feasible at the time. He said it's going to be really rough on him, and since gender is learned, put him in a dress, call him Brenda, raise him as a female, don't tell anybody. Apparently they had a small family where he thought they could get away with it. Don't tell anybody, raise him as a female, and he'll be a female. Well, it turned out that David was a psychological mess all through childhood. He was very tomboyish as a female, didn't really fit in socially, had problems in school, tried to commit suicide a couple times in early adolescence, and after one of those suicide attempts, the dad went to Brenda and said, I think I know why you're so distressed and life is so hard for you. It is because you're really a male. And at that point, maybe a light bulb went off on in his head, and he realized that this is the way out of the issues, the problems. But at some point thereafter, he changed his name to David, put on pants, the stereotypical male pants, played the male role, dated females, and eventually married a woman, adopted the child or children that she had, tried to live a normal life, but all through his young married life and his young 20s, he was still messed up psychologically. Eventually he committed suicide. I think he was young 30s. He committed suicide, and I think that was probably 10 years or so ago, maybe 15. His brother, who went through this all with him kind of vicariously and with all the family upheaval and turmoil associated with it, he also committed suicide. So it's a really traumatic ending, not positive at all. But many people point out the David Reimer story as an example of why the biological theory of gender differences is correct. You can't just socialize a male to be female or vice versa, because it's biologically determined internally. It's not just, in other words, gender is not just psychological and sociological, as we talked about at the outset of this chapter. There must be some biological component to it, which again maybe leads into discussion of gender identity disorder. Maybe the gender identity dysphoric individual has some biological thing going on there that is leading it, and that's the reason why they don't seem to be mentally ill. There's something else going on, and that's the reason why also therapy is not really effective. Now, I want to point out that that's not a really good study. To the David Reimer case study is not a really good study to definitively show that biology is more important than nurture in terms of gender, because of the fact that he was 8 months old before he had the botched circumcision, and he was probably between 8 months and a year, maybe close to a year, before it was finally determined that they were going to raise him as a female. And so he was socialized as a male for that long. And if Freud is correct at all, and I think he is correct in some of these areas, those first several months of one's life are very important in so many psychological ways to make us who we are as future adolescents and adults. And so you can't discount the effect of being socialized as a male for perhaps up to a year. Ideally, if we had the opportunity through some sort of unethical world that we might live in, we would raise a male as a female from day one, or a female as a male from day one, and see if that worked. And then we'd have a good test of the biological theory. This David Reimer story is not a good test, but it is a very interesting story if you can read about it on the internet or read the book. As Nature Made Him, I think, is the name of the book. All right, let's look at nature versus nurture. I want to point out that most scientists would say that on the continuum of anything, any difference you could talk about between males and females, it probably is the case that there's a basic biological difference between males and females that kind of sets the foundation for that difference, whatever it is: spatial, rotation skills, verbal skills, nurturing skills, emotional skills. But what society does is it takes that basic biological difference and kind of runs with it and embellishes it and adds to it. So we end up with larger differences between males and females than what nature gives us, because society acts on those differences and then runs with it and makes it bigger. Small amount would be due to nature. Most of it's probably due to nurture. Now, that's not necessarily scientific, but that's a view that many people have, that the gender differences that do exist are product of both nature and nurture, mostly nurture. I want to point out that some parents will say, look, I tried to raise my boys to be nurturing, give them dolls and those sort of things, but what happened was they just picked the dolls up and threw them around at each other as weapons and projectiles. And so trying to raise them gender neutral or atypical just didn't work, because they're just naturally more aggressive. These same parents with female children have been known to say, you know, I tried to put my females in more male-oriented situations and make them more masculine where it's appropriate to be masculine, but when I gave them toy guns to play with, we wouldn't do that anymore. And in these generations, back when I was a kid, we got guns for Christmas, toy guns for Christmas. So I tried to give these parents would say, I tried to give my female children toy guns, but all they did was they wrapped them up into blankets and cuddled them. Okay, more technical difficulties. Sorry about that. All right, let's move on to a couple of other things. I won't spend too much time on this, but sexual motivation. There's biological factors as well as psychological factors that influences our sexual drive. I just want to mention that hormones do play a role. The hypothalamus plays a role in our biological sex drive. Hypothalamus seems to be involved in strong drives, things that are pleasurable, and also things that are marked as being important to us. They're marked that way apparently through dopamine in the hypothalamus, and sex is going to be one of those things. Turns out with hormones, it's not huge in humans, but the primary hormone for human sexual arousal is testosterone. That's not the case with most mammals. We're one of the exceptions, maybe the only exception. If you're a female mammal of any kind, basically other than humans, then it's estrogen that drives biologically your sex drive, and it's going to be the thing that drives your sex drive. If you're a male mammal other than a human, it's going to be testosterone. If you're deprived of testosterone, you're not going to be sexually motivated. For humans, they play a role, but most importantly would be external stimuli and cognitive factors. Now, if you take a human sexuality class, your teacher will tell you that the most important sex organ for humans is the brain. And by that, they don't necessarily mean the structure of the hypothalamus and the hormones involved. What they mean is the mind. The most important sexual organ for humans is the mind, because it's in the mind that we can learn to take that sex drive and funnel it or channel it in association with external stimuli, pictures and actions and contexts. And there's all sorts of thinking and imaginations and other things we can do in our brain that can actually cause us to be sexually motivated, even in the absence of the hormones telling us to be sexually driven, sexually motivated. We can create sexual arousal in its biological absence, and we can shut it off. And I do agree that the sex drive is pretty compelling sometimes, but humans do have the ability to channel it, to modulate it, to tame it, to put it under self-control in order to stay married to your wife or your husband, or to be faithful to whomever, to not land in jail. We have that ability, most of us. Some people may have lesser degrees of that ability than others, because we're all different. But in general, we're human, we have that ability. And so that suggests, without a whole lot of discussion, that the primary important factors involved in sexual motivation for humans are psychological and mental. Now, if we talk about sexual preference, homosexuality. There are biological factors. There's the hypothalamus and genes. We don't know a whole lot here, but early on there was a study done by Simon LeVay, and I mentioned this in class earlier in the semester, on cadavers. When he looked at their cellular structure and the size of their cells in a certain part of the hypothalamus, he found that they were a third to half the size in the gay males that he studied than in the heterosexual males that he studied. Now, this area of the brain that he was interested in was an area known to be involved in sexual arousal, so he thought it might be involved in sexual orientation as well. And he found, again, that the smaller the cell size in these male cadavers, the more that correlated with their sexual orientation being homosexual. Okay, more technical difficulties, but so the gay males had smaller cell sizes than the heterosexual males, and that size was roughly the same size as the cell sizes in the heterosexual females. And by extrapolation, he figured, he didn't have a whole lot of data to support this, but he figured that a lesbian or a homosexual female, their cell sizes would be larger and more similar to the heterosexual males. So in other words, homosexual males have a feminized brain and homosexual females have a masculinized brain. And he believed, Simon LeVay believed, that that was the cause of homosexuality. He didn't know that, but that's what he thought. Around the same time, this was early 90s, a guy named Dean Hamer, Hamer, found that there was a sequence of DNA in gay males that didn't exist in heterosexual males. And he did this research in the same family where there was multiple boys. He found that the homosexual boys in the family shared the sequence of DNA that the other heterosexual males in the family didn't. And then there's more recent research that says that in a family of a lot of male children, the younger males are more likely to have a sexual orientation that's gay. Something about the female mom's body creating antibodies to kind of fight off the testosterone in their male offspring. And over time, that just builds up and makes it more likely that the testosterone exposure of the male children later on is less than the testosterone exposure than the older children, earlier born male children would get. So there are these biological theories that talk about the biological reasons for and the factors involved in sexual orientation. That's just some of those theories and some of those ideas. I want to move to the psychological factors. No research has been able to pinpoint any kind of upbringing issue, environmental issue, or nurture issue that correlates with sexual orientation. People raised by homosexual parents are just as likely to be heterosexual or homosexual as the rest of the population. Males raised with weak fathers or absent fathers are just as likely to be heterosexual as those who are not raised by weak or absent fathers. Those are kind of the stereotypical things that people have suggested are the nurture-related factors associated with homosexuality, but no research actually supports that. I do want to point out, and I also want to point out that culture seems to be kind of indiscriminate in terms of, and races across the world. These things seem to be indiscriminate in terms of sexual orientation. You'll find homosexuality in all populations on the planet and throughout history, as far as we know. So this kind of seems to most people, most scientists, that the psychological factors of note are probably less important than the biological factors. But having said that, I want to point out that the concordance rate for homosexuality, you can read this more clearly online on the PowerPoint online. The concordance rate for homosexuality is about 50% for both males and females, slightly higher for males than females, for identical twins. So if you have an identical twin who is gay, chances are 50% of the time you're going to be gay as well. 50%. That means that there's probably some sort of biology going on that underlies homosexuality. The concordance rate for homosexuality in fraternal twins is roughly half. So it's about 20. It's a little less than half. It's about 20%. So if you're a fraternal twin and your fraternal twin is gay, 20% of the time, you're going to be gay as well. Now, if you have an adopted sibling and your adopted sibling is gay, the chances of you being gay are about, I think it's about 5%, 2 to 5%. I can't see the numbers myself right now, but they're quite a bit lower. The more related you are to somebody who is gay, the more you share the same DNA, the more likely you're going to share the same sexual orientation. And that would be true regardless of nurture, even if you're raised in different environments. So what that suggests is that biology is important, but if you think about it, it also suggests that nurture is important. Now, we don't know how it's important, but there's something going on there. If it was totally biology, then it would be 100% concordance or 90+% concordance. It's just not. That must be there's something else going on there. Now, let me just say that back in the 1990s, when Dean Hamer and Simon LeVay were doing their research, basically the idea floating around was that homosexuality is biological. It's like 90-10 biology versus nurture. But slowly since then, I think if you could put numbers to nature and nurture, I think the realization is that it might be quite a bit less than that, not 90-10, not 80-20, maybe 70-30. We just don't know. It's really hard to say in terms of quantifying nature versus nurture. But the one thing that you hear most often today about homosexuality is that we just don't know. And that's led a lot of people to say that we just don't know because it's highly complex and it's highly individualized, very variable from every individual to every other individual. And other people say, okay, then let's just forget it. We don't need to worry about determining why people are gay. We just need to accept it and live with it and be tolerant and accepting and pass laws and create a society which is fair to all people regardless of their sexual orientation. And I would agree, but at the same time, if you're a scientist, you probably still want to figure it out, not for prejudice purposes or any kind of discrimination purposes, just because you want to figure it out. It's kind of like the Mount Everest to some psychologists. And you just have to be careful if you're doing that kind of research that it doesn't get used against anybody. Simon LeVay, for one, when he found that his research was going to be beginning to be used against people who were gay, that people were now saying, okay, now that we know that homosexuality is biological and it has something to do with hypothalamus cells, now we can figure out a way to change it and to fix it. And that's exactly what Simon LeVay didn't want to have happen, so he actually stopped doing the research. And I think others have been kind of the same way. They don't want to do research that would suggest a way to create more prejudice and discrimination, which we don't want. So anyway, the bottom line here is we just don't know about homosexuality, and maybe it doesn't matter. That's the chapter. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope things are going well with you. And I'll see you next time when we're going to talk about abnormal behavior, chapter 14. Bye.